All right. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. My name is Emily Conron. I'm here with the N7 campaign. We're a campaign of the Global Network for Neglected Tropical Diseases at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. I realize I haven't actually convinced you of anything yet, but I am going to start passing around an email sign-up sheet if you'd like to learn more. And I promise a few minutes and you'll definitely want to put your email in, so you can just start now. So what I'm going to go over in my presentation today are the 7 most common neglected tropical diseases, or NTDs, the solution we have for all of these diseases, the goal of the N7 campaign, and kind of a little bit about why we were created, and then the special role we think students and universities have to play in this effort. So to begin with, I'm going to show a quick video that really introduces you to the visual, physical impact of NTDs.
I'm sure you want to see the end of this as much as I do.
The great news is that we can.
All it takes is a simple packet of pills.
All it costs is 50 cents.
To treat and protect a child for a whole year against all 7 of these diseases.
What's even more amazing is that if we all join in, we can see the end of all of them by 2020.
Join in and be part of something huge by liking N7 on Facebook, making a small donation and spreading the word by telling all your friends.
Together, we can see the end.
So that video obviously gives you a pretty strong introduction to the impact that NTDs can have. But you might be wondering why these diseases that are clearly quite different symptomatically, why they're grouped together under this one label of neglected tropical diseases, or NTDs. And that's because they share a few key characteristics that led to them kind of being christened as NTDs in the mid-2000s by a group of scientists who'd been individually working on various diseases under this umbrella for many years and decided to sort of popularize this term, neglected tropical diseases. So the first characteristic is that NTDs are incredibly widespread diseases. They're the most common afflictions of the world's poorest people, those living on less than $1.25 a day, and they infect more than 1 billion people around the world. So the breakdown is about 1.4 billion people currently infected with at least one of those 7 diseases, and another 1.6 billion living in areas that put them at direct risk of contracting an NTD. So all told, that's about half of the world's population, either currently infected or at risk. And this map gives you a good sense of just how widespread NTDs are geographically. So this isn't a map of prevalence, but rather how many of these diseases are present in each country. And you'll see at the far end of the scale here, it says 7+, And that's because the World Health Organization actually classifies 17 diseases as NTDs. Our campaign and our organization more broadly focuses on the 7 most common because they're by far the most common. The 7 most common make up about 95% of the burden of all 17 overall, and they're all what we call PCT, or preventive chemotherapy ready diseases that can be treated on a large scale at a very low cost. So the second characteristic that kind of groups NTDs together and is directly related to how widespread they are is that they're out of sight. So they're really linked to rural poverty and tend to infect populations that have very little political voice or ability to demand treatment. That's why they're sometimes called the forgotten diseases of forgotten people. And they're ancient diseases, so they're not these exciting, emerging infectious diseases that make headlines. NTDs have been around basically since humans have been around. So they're written about in the Bible, in the writings of the ancient Egyptians and Greeks. And some of the treatments we have for NTDs are actually decades old. So it's not that we didn't have treatments available, but rather we kind of lacked the will to get treatment to people in need. So anyone here have a pet dog at home? You probably give your dog HeartGuard to prevent heartworm. So the scientific formulation of that drug it's called ivermectin, and it's the exact same drug we use to treat and prevent river blindness in humans. But it was originally developed for use in dogs, and it was only later we realized that it was effective against river blindness. So kind of a telling example of sometimes how pharmaceutical development is motivated not necessarily by a need, but by a profit interest. So the next characteristic is that NTDs are chronic diseases. We call them high morbidity, low mortality diseases that kill relatively few people relative to how many people they infect. So 530,000 people a year is certainly not a small number of deaths, but relative to the 1.4 billion people infected, that's relatively low. But that's because the impact of NTDs is longer term. They are disabling and disfiguring diseases that cause everything from swollen abdomens and limbs to rashes that cover your entire body and can be quite painful and debilitating, to inverting your eyelashes and making you scratch your cornea until you go blind. These are horrific diseases with horrific impact, but sometimes that impact is spread over time and maybe isn't as obvious to see. So really, NTDs, their biggest impact is in the long-term disabilities that they cause. This is a picture of my friend Eve. I met Eve when I was in Haiti as a college senior researching the impact of elephantiasis on mental health. And Eve was one of the patients I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing, talking to him about his experience. He was about 35 when this picture was taken, and he had been infected by elephantiasis since he was 9 years old. So looking at this picture, it's really not difficult to imagine the impact that this disease had on every aspect of his life, from trying to get an education, trying to find a job and provide for a family, actually wanting to get married and have children, but the stigma associated with his disease obviously made that very difficult. So in my conversations with Eve and other patients, I really heard about the hidden psychosocial impact of these diseases. They can be very stigmatizing and sometimes lead to social isolation, particularly in areas where maybe their scientific cause is not well understood. So people come up with alternative explanations for why they're infected, why their friends and family are infected. And this can kind of create an intergenerational impact. So I heard over and over again from patients that it wasn't just the person who was directly infected with elephantiasis or a similar NTD. They weren't the only ones impacted by it, but their whole family was because of the stigma that was associated with it. So that's part of the reason that NTDs are such poverty-promoting diseases. They're intergenerational impact. So they keep kids from attending school, and they stunt their cognitive development, so even if they are able to go to school, they can't learn as effectively. They keep adults from working, so either, again, an adult who's directly infected being not able to go to work, or having to care for a family member keeps them from work as well. And this, again, just creates an intergenerational poverty trap that makes it so much harder for families and communities to live in extreme poverty. So that's kind of the bird's eye umbrella view of all NTDs together and kind of why we call them what we do. And I'm just quickly going to go through the 7 most common NTDs, a bit about their symptoms and prevalence, and the order that I'll go in reflects a mnemonic device I came up with for myself. Again, as a college senior, I've been active in NTDs for a few years, and people would often ask me to name off the 7 most common, And even after 3 or 4 years of this, I had trouble. They all have different names, and I'd go out of order and get confused. So I finally came up with a way to keep track, and it was, we have resources to relieve everyone's suffering. So both groups them together in a way that makes sense to me and kind of makes a strong statement about what we believe about NTDs. So going in that order, first we have whipworm. Whipworm is the first of 3 intestinal parasites or soil-transmitted helminths that I'll talk about today. So their name kind of tells you how they're transmitted through contaminated soil. So you can contract whipworm by walking barefoot on contaminated soil, eating a fruit or vegetable that hasn't been washed properly. And really the symptoms, the overt symptoms of whipworm are gastrointestinal, so abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting. But again, the more serious impact of this disease and all 3 of these soil-transmitted helminths or intestinal worms is longer term and harder to see. And it's that they're really linked to stunted growth. So stunted physical growth and then again, stunted cognitive growth. And whipworm infects about 800 million people around the world. Next is hookworm, not difficult to see why it's called hookworm if you're looking at it under a microscope, and then at the site of an infection. And hookworm, again, transmitted through contaminated soil, some similar symptoms to whipworm, but one of the really pernicious effects of hookworm is anemia, so really linked to elevated rates of anemia. And this is particularly difficult and dangerous for pregnant women. And there's a high overlap in sub-Saharan Africa. Hundreds of millions of women are infected with hookworm, and this makes their pregnancies much more dangerous. And hookworm infects about 700 million people. So just based on those first 2 prevalence estimates, you can already tell that most people with at least one NTD are actually co-infected with more than one at the same time, because just those first 2 prevalence estimates added together already exceed the 1.4 billion number that I mentioned before. So the third soil-transmitted helminth is roundworm. This is a picture of a child whose abdomen is distended because of the worm burden in his intestines. And roundworm, again, some similar symptoms to the first 2, but these worms actually grow much larger than whipworms or hookworms. They can grow to 14 inches long and the width of a pencil inside of you. So again, not difficult to imagine the type of impact that would have on your health. And roundworm is the most common NTD, estimated to infect about 1.2 billion people worldwide. So trachoma, the next disease I'll talk about, is the only one I'll mention today that's a bacterial disease rather than parasitic. So trachoma, the bacteria spread from person to person either through close personal contact or by these eye-seeking flies that pick up the bacteria near your eye, carry it to another person. So these flies, again, carry the bacteria from person to person, and this bacteria causes tissue buildup under the eyelid that actually causes your eyelid to turn in on itself, so that every time you blink, you're actually scratching your cornea with your own eyelashes. And if that's not corrected over time by surgery, it can actually lead to blindness. And trachoma is the leading cause of preventable blindness in the world, infecting 41 million people. And the next NTD is river blindness or onchocerciasis. It's a picture of someone blinded by onco. And this disease is transmitted by black flies, but again, it's the bite of a fly, so this is a parasitic disease again. And this causes severe skin rashes, nodules that develop under your skin, and in your eyeball actually, which is what can lead to blindness. And this is the second leading cause of preventable blindness in the world, infecting 26 million people. Next is lymphatic filariasis, or it's known by its overt symptom of elephantiasis oftentimes. And I mentioned this with my friend Eve. But this disease is transmitted by mosquitoes, so the bite of a mosquito carries the filarial larva from person to person. Over time, this disease causes blockages in the lymphatic system that lead to really severe swelling of the limbs, which that's the condition we know as elephantiasis. Or in men, oftentimes the symptomology is actually swelling of the scrotum, and that's a condition like hydrocele. Both obviously very painful, both very disfiguring, and often, many times, stigmatizing. And this disease infects 120 million people worldwide, about a third of whom have the overt symptoms of either elephantiasis or hydrocele. And then the last disease I'll talk about today is schistosomiasis, also known as snail fever, or bilharzia in some parts of the world. And snail fever, this is a picture of a woman with a very late stage, and ultimately in her case, fatal case of schistosomiasis. It's the deadliest NTD, leading to about 230,000 deaths per year, although that's just a fraction of the 240 million people it infects. It's spread by snails that live in fresh water, so lakes, streams, and it causes fever, abdominal pain, again, anemia, and then this very dangerous organ enlargement, which is what you saw in the picture of that woman. So beyond just the physical symptoms of NTDs, it's helpful to kind of look more broadly to really get a true sense of their impact. So one way to do this is by looking at the MDGs, or Millennium Development Goals. As I'm sure most of you know, the MDGs have been in the news a lot lately because we are currently getting to the end of the MDGs. They will expire at the end of 2015, and we will be transitioning into a new set of development goals that are being called the Sustainable Development Goals. So looking at 6 of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, we can see direct connections between what we were trying to achieve with that goal, and perhaps part of the reason we didn't achieve it related to NTDs in some way or another. So just to point out 2 that I find particularly compelling. Our first goal, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Oftentimes when we think about world hunger, we think about people lacking access to food, and that being the main cause of malnutrition. But we actually see in children infected with intestinal worms or schistosomiasis, even if they have enough safe, healthy, nutritious food, if they're not being dewormed, they have very high rates of malnutrition. And that's because these worms live in your intestines, and they're literally living off of the food that you eat. So even if you're eating enough, you're not getting all the nutrients you need from your food. And then just to point out goal number 6, to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, I could have an entirely separate lecture on the impact that grouping all but 2 diseases in the world under the umbrella of other diseases had on global health more broadly, and I'm sure many of you would appreciate a lecture like that. But for my purposes today, I'll just mention that there are direct connections between HIV, malaria, TB, and then these lesser known neglected tropical diseases. So one connection, which is still being explored, and it's hard to say definitively what this connection is, but we have some pretty compelling evidence already, is that women with female genital schistosomiasis, one subset of snail fever, have a 3 to 4 times elevated rate of contracting HIV. And that's because this type of schisto causes lesions to develop in the vaginal tract that make women much more susceptible to contracting HIV during intercourse. So it might be part of the reason that Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the only areas of the world where women are at a higher risk of contracting HIV than men. So beyond just the physical symptoms of NTDs and what we see their impact on development, I think it's good to kind of step back and allow people affected by these diseases to speak for themselves. And I always like this part of the presentation because I talk for 15 minutes and throw a lot of facts and statistics and numbers at you, and it can get kind of overwhelming and kind of depressing. And so this is a good point in the presentation to step back and just listen to a story and see the impact that NTDs have on one family in Kenya. So I will let Nima and Fatuma take it from here.
Naelewa kama kijiji kilicho kimezungukwa na maji, ni nchi iliyo haina barabara, ni nchi iliyo haina hospitali, na huwa tunakumbwa na magonjwa, madawa hatupati. Na hahanda kazi zangu ni za kulima na kuvuna matunda na kuuza kama zile zenyewe. Ali limunzo Fatuma rakizana madama kwa ngela ndio kwa ngimula kama sukuri mala sana managita mandaji ndisukuri mzima kiafya sina tabu hiyo, sina pesa zangu zile, wakimwingilia mwanangu na mimi nitenge asa yune majuyu anokongoro na karibu miaka mingi yone. Lakini nipigo siku da ndio kala leo unambaro kubudulia kama nazo nyata zoko kombo na bado kidogo usiku tana shamba pesho na wako mbao pesho kana mshibaro na sija chocha ta ukala akimla sukuli la nishimufu Fatuma ayana ke tumana ile kasikila la kulenga mara kongolo na ndana ile mati haya bena nizo dawazi lakini na kuyakala hana dawa ya dimeka msidi ile mwana ale nam jaribu kuna mtana mkira mola kisa kufaulu. Fatuma aliendelea toto tunamwona na mwana anaenda kanisani. Kula kiasi. Na afya kwa kweli anafia yetu tutumeni. Mwanzo kana wakapilula kwa kwanza kulima tanema na mwana ngasha mdomana na shughuli za kanisa tulisirele kwa mafana yake tena lazima mtu kauli mambo rich. Udila na kwevu usomishipa na minyoyo kwa lifunda hola kusini kama lenzi masaficheka ni humo hiyo mimi nataka
I think that video is both a great story and again one that doesn't rely on statistics or graphs to get your attention but really touches you at the emotional level. But it's also a great intro to the next part of the presentation, which is actually a lot more straightforward to talk about, and that's the solution we have to these 7 NTDs. So something amazing happened in January 2012 that I think has not been talked about enough, and it was this big gathering in London that resulted in something called the London Declaration on NTDs. So 13 pharmaceutical companies and a number of NGOs and national governments came together and signed this declaration, which pledged really material and financial support to reach the goal to control and eliminate 10 of the most common NTDs, so a few more in addition to the one I talked about today, by the year 2020. And so this World Health Organization roadmap on NTDs had recently been released, and this meeting and the declaration that came out of it was really an expression of the commitment to achieve these goals. So what we do with the 7 most common NTDs is something called mass drug administration. We are administering preventative drugs to entire swaths of populations in endemic areas. So the drugs are safe and effective and have so few side effects that you actually don't need to be tested before receiving them. We simply administer them to everyone in an affected population, and this helps us actually interrupt transmission. So we call it the rapid impact package of 4 drugs that treat and prevent 7 NTDs, and they're listed out there. I won't try to say them out loud, although if you want to try and say diethylcarbamazine, see, I can't even do it once. Diethylcarbamazine citrate 5 times fast, you're welcome to. So this drug donation scheme has to be kind of supervised and run at a pretty high level. So this is something we want ministries of health and national governments to be directly involved with. It can't really be done on a village by village or state by state basis. We want entire governments kind of coordinating this response. But once that's done and once the drugs can get where they need to go, as you saw in the video, they actually can be administered by community members, by we call them community drug distributors or CDDs that receive pretty minimal amounts of training just in what to look for as far as potential side effects, how to figure out the dosing scheme. And one really great partner in this effort is actually teachers. So this is a picture of a school-based deworming campaign that went on in India and treated something like 50 million school children across a few districts in India. And so teachers, once trained, can actually run these drug distributions in schools, thereby directly reaching out to the population most affected by NTDs, which is children. So the cost of this is pretty amazing. As was alluded to in both of the videos I already showed, the average global cost comes out to about 50 cents per person per year, which covers the cost of delivering drugs, training community drug distributors, mobilizing communities, and educating them about the purpose of these drug distributions so that they're informed and they want to participate. Obviously, that's a key component of this. And then the follow-up monitoring and evaluation, where we ensure that we're actually seeing infection rates go down and eventually, hopefully, we see these diseases controlled and eliminated. So of course, despite that being a very low cost and this being a pretty straightforward global health effort, we haven't necessarily seen the type of response we need, and we haven't seen the response accelerate in the way it needs to actually reach that 2020 goal. So a snapshot of that is looking at the United States global health funding. NTDs currently receive less than 1% of all global health funding from the United States, which again, relative to the number of people they infect is a pretty sorry tale looking at that pie chart. And then if we're looking globally, the annual funding gap between what donor countries are donating and endemic countries are spending out of their own health budgets, we're missing about $220 million per year. So a substantial amount of money, but again, relative to a lot of things we spend money on, both in global health and obviously in development broadly, not all that much money. So it's a lot, but also not that much if you think about it in a certain way. So because of that funding gap and the persistent, obviously, neglect of these diseases, the End 7 campaign was launched about a year and a half ago to try to mobilize really a public movement against NTDs. So, this had been building for a while behind closed doors and in these high-level meetings that never got any media attention and certainly never really got into the public conversation. And so N7 is an attempt to change that and to familiarize the general public with NTDs to the same extent that many people are now aware of global health challenges like HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, things like that. So this is just a quick overview of how we purport to do that. And first of all, we are an awareness campaign. So we're very active on Facebook, Twitter, all social media channels. Obviously, we have a very active YouTube channel. And again, this is just an attempt to bring NTDs into the public conversation. And then we're really a storytelling campaign. So whereas in the past, people thought that we could convince people with, again, facts and charts and graphs, we think you have to reach people on an emotional level. And we do that by telling stories. And really by letting people affected by NTDs tell their own story. And then we pursue traditional media amplification. So the connection I mentioned between female genital schistosomiasis and HIV was covered in a front page story on the New York Times in May. And the president of our organization was quoted, and it was very exciting to see that connection start to receive the attention it deserves. But as you probably know, awareness in and of itself is nice. It makes us feel good. or aware of the problem, but unless that's actually translated into public support, we're really not doing our job. So we think public support is expressed in two main ways: through grassroots advocacy. So we run petitions targeting influential international leaders. Last fall, we ran a petition asking Ban Ki-moon to really elevate the issues surrounding NTDs as we're talking about the post-2015 development agenda. And we were very pleased to get a personal response to that petition from his special advisor on post-2015 development planning. And because of this petition and the public support it evidenced, we were actually able to get a meeting with Amina Mohammed, which was a great win for our campaign. In April, we ran a petition asking the US Congress to not implement a cut to the NTD budget that the president had suggested in his budget request. We're not exactly sure why, but for 6 years in a row, President Obama has recommended a cut to the USAID NTD program. Thankfully, Congress has never listened to him, and NTD funding has actually risen all 6 years, but obviously that's a threat every year. So we ran a petition, we printed all of the names on a giant scroll, and we actually delivered it to Congress, which was something pretty fun to be involved with. Our current petition is targeting US Ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Counselor, Elizabeth Cousins. She is a key actor in the post-2015 development agenda setting process, in the process of setting these sustainable development goals. So our current petition has been signed by over 1,000 university students across the country, and you actually have an opportunity today, if you'd like, to participate in that. So I'm quickly going to pass around some postcards that have a message on the back, our ask of the ambassador. You can write your name, university email, and then on the front you can actually write a personal message. So the question, the prompt if you will, is why NTDs, why now? And if you want to just think of maybe something that stuck out to you from this presentation, something you'd like to say to a world leader, we would love for you to participate. And then the other way that public support is expressed both for N7 and for this movement more broadly is through donations. So we are a fundraising campaign. We are not, I always want to emphasize this, we are not attempting to raise $220 million a year and fill that funding gap alone, but what we do is very targeted fundraising. So we choose projects around the world being run, again, by ministries of health, by well-respected and well-connected NGOs, and with modest amounts of funding that we raise through grassroots fundraising, we're able to make a really substantial impact. So I have one more quick 1-minute video I'll show about a recent project we funded in Honduras.
Hi N7 supporters, my name is Karen and I'm with the N7 campaign. Thanks to your support last year, we were able to reach over 1 million school children in over 11,000 schools here in Honduras. Today we're here at a school, we're in Marcovia, one of the poorest areas in the southernmost state of Honduras called Choluteca. As you can see, you have a lot of children running around here happy who have recently benefited from deworming treatment.
Contamos nosotros con 881 alumnos a los que se les ha dado ya la pastillita Felicity Pris.
Thanks to your support, we were also able to provide clean water to the local community where over 100,000 people are benefiting. This helps us rid these children and others of parasites. Now they have the energy they need to do well in school and live a healthy life.
El proceso para la elaboración del cloro es bien sencillo, porque eso va a base de sal y agua nada más, ¿verdad? Estamos orientando a toda la población para que ellos puedan ser beneficiarios de este proyecto.
We couldn't have done this without your support. Thank you from Honduras. Muchas gracias.
So again, we like to think of our fundraising and our grassroots resource mobilization as creating success stories that we can elevate and really use as an advocacy piece to drive this higher level resource mobilization, which will actually get us to fill that $220 million funding gap. And we're seeing incredible successes. I always like to say that this is obviously a tough issue to work on, and having seen the impact of NTDs firsthand, something I take very seriously. But it's also a really exciting issue to work on and really inspiring because we're already seeing success happen. We're just trying to make that happen faster and drive progress forward. So on a country-by-country basis, that is beginning to happen. Colombia recently became the first country in the in South America to eliminate river blindness, and a number of their neighbors are set to receive WHO verification of the same very soon. So tracking that progress worldwide is really exciting. So by creating these success stories through our advocacy, through our fundraising, we're helping to build political will for this cause from donor countries like the US and the UK that we'd love to just bump that 1% up to 2%. That would make a huge difference. And then also from endemic countries. So we really strongly believe that this is an effort that has to be driven by endemic countries. They need to be committing resources from their own health budgets to these mass drug administration programs if they are to be sustainable. Because MDAs do need to be run on a yearly basis, usually for 6 or 7 years before you're actually going to achieve complete control and elimination. So for that to happen on a yearly basis, we really want it to be country-owned and country-driven. So this political will is allowing programs to scale up and reach more people so that we can actually achieve our goal to see the end of the 7 most common NTDs in the next decade. So the very last thing I'll talk about today is the special role that we think students and universities have to play in this effort, and that kind of falls under 3 areas. So the first being advocacy. So college students are natural advocates. You are articulate, you're interested in politics and policy, and we really hope that you'll consider supporting our advocacy actions as they arise through things like our postcard campaign, through our online petitions. There are lots of ways to get involved, and this year, if you are on our email list, you will get a monthly action kit that will kind of give you resources to participate on a monthly basis depending on what our focus is. Students are also really key at helping us spread awareness and again, just raise the volume of this conversation. And this might seem like a small thing to you, posting a video on Facebook or tweeting about us, but from our end, I can't tell you the difference that it makes. We like to think, again, that we have these beautiful videos that tell amazing stories, but we put them out there, and if no one's watching them, we're not really accomplishing anything. So pushing them out on a grassroots basis through your networks is really important. And then finally, by fundraising. So we have lots of ideas if you're interested in getting involved on that level and helping us create those success stories. And definitely reach out to me if you want to get involved, if you want to create your own fundraising page or get Duke involved more broadly in that effort. And then the petition you just signed on the postcards can also be found online. And if you'd like, again, to post this link on social media, please feel free to do so. So I wanted to end today with a quote that I think really encapsulates some of kind of the ideas behind what I've talked about today. I will admit it's a quote that's not directly about NTDs. I stole it from an essay about the UNICEF Child Survival Revolution, which perhaps some of you have studied in your classes. But to give you some context, this was an effort that began in the mid-1980s to really drive up basic vaccination rates and increase access to oral rehydration therapy. So 2 very specific health interventions that UNICEF actually received some criticism for. Why are we only focusing on these things when there are so many problems we need to be focusing on? And this was kind of one of the responses given to that question broadly, and something that I think really sums up our answer to the question of why NTDs, why now? And the quote goes like this: "It's not just that these were important problems touching large numbers of children. There are plenty of important problems facing the world's children. The point is that these were problems for which solutions were available and affordable, so much so that it was unconscionable not to put them into action, not to do what it was now so obviously possible to do. Morality must march with capacity." So if you agree that morality must march with capacity and we should implement solutions that we have, solutions that are cost effective and can make a huge impact on the health of large numbers of children and families, I hope you'll consider joining the N7 campaign, getting involved here at Duke or in your own community, so that together we can see the end. So thank you for your attention today and for coming out, and I'm happy to take any questions you have at this time.
So as Duke's a big research institution, and especially a lot of people in our Masters of Global Health program are going to be getting involved in research projects and doing field work, global health related. In terms of NTDs, where do you think research is still needed, and what type of things would you like to see students researching, particularly related to NTDs?
Sure. So I'll say 2 things. The first is that the drugs we currently have are safe and effective, but we're always looking into the future And we are always paying attention to whether the response to these drugs is going down. That is potentially a danger. So while they're safe and effective now, we do want to have other drugs in the pipeline if that becomes necessary in the future. I'll also say the N7 campaign, as I said, is part of the Global Network for Neglected Tropical Diseases, which is in turn part of the Sabin Vaccine Institute. One of the other program areas of Sabin is something called the Product Development Partnership. It's our vaccine development team based out of Baylor College of Medicine that's actually working on vaccines for a number of these NTDs. So if we had a choice between a safe and effective vaccine that only needed to be administered one time versus mass drug administration that has to happen on a yearly basis, obviously a vaccine would be fantastic. But we are advocating for increased access to what we have while we're looking to the future about what we might need. But I'd say what I would love an institution like Duke in terms of NTD research to focus on is really implementation science. So using drugs and treatments that we have, how do we make our efforts to actually get them into populations more effective? I think there's some really interesting research being done in the area of, again, this kind of social mobilization. How do you actually get people to participate in these drug campaigns? Because if you stage an MDA and you've done everything right, but no one shows up, you haven't really achieved your job. So how do you really drive that health education message out and get people to participate voluntarily in these MDA campaigns is something I'd love to see more research on. Yeah.
What is the correlation between trying to pull together the study and other programs that are treating things like HIV that are going to remote areas already to try to address health problems? Where is the partnership there?
Yeah, so that's a message as an advocacy organization we've been pushing forward for years, that we're developing these really effective vertical programs for HIV, TB, malaria, and that there's strong geographic correlations between those diseases and NTDs. So for that very small additional cost, we can tack on NTD treatment. So there are countries, particularly with malaria, that are doing a good job on a policy level, integrating their malaria and particularly lymphatic filariasis responses, because LF is a mosquito-borne illness. So things like bed nets are equally effective at preventing LF as they are malaria. So there are certain countries, particularly in Africa, that are doing a good job of kind of looking at those connections and designing programs that are looking at them together and looking at broadly, how can we integrate NTD treatment into other health efforts. I'd say on the whole, we could do a lot better as a global community, not just for NTDs, but for many conditions that we wish we could kind of break down some silos between our responses.
Thank you.
So my question is following up to Elise's question, it seems like a lot of these entities are focused, are in the areas which are the least developed places as well. So how much of a role do you think integration with development of a place can play, and what are you doing about that, raising awareness? For example, there were some entities that, you can get through food or water, simple things like having filtration of water that you're drinking. Those go a long way and are definitely even more sustainable than drugs. So is your organization focusing on those even more sustainable efforts for eradication of NTDs?
Definitely, and as you saw in the video, many of the programs we've funded have, again, those longer term components looking at water sanitation, partnering with nutrition programs. That's another big partnership we look at. I guess our message, again, as an advocacy organization is that we want to see those long-term changes happen, and we'll do our part to accelerate progress towards that. But in the meantime, because we know it's not going to happen next year that everyone has access to a toilet or everyone has access to safe water. So for this really low cost, if we can get this pretty simple treatment into the hands of people, we see it as a very empowering move where you're improving the health of communities so that they have the health and energy and hopefully education and workforce they need to address those longer term problems in a way that makes sense in their context so that they can devise solutions that make sense for them. But we, again, see NTD treatment with the MDA strategy, with the drugs we currently have, as just getting a foot in the door, right? Creating that very lowest rung on the ladder of development. There's a great quote from Margaret Chan, Secretary General of WHO, where she says, NTDs are a litmus test for health systems' ability to reach vulnerable populations. So if we can't reach people once a year with pills that don't need to be refrigerated, that can be transported long distances without worrying about losing their efficacy, if we can't do that, clearly our health systems are not going to be able to deliver much more sophisticated interventions. So again, we are honest about this being kind of the first and most basic rung, but we think it's a very necessary one. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
So you mentioned about the political will within the endemic countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you, what is the like local government or their domestic government, their engagement or efforts towards this kind of project or disease?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are kind of entering a new phase as an organization where instead of trying to work on everything in every country, which we tried to do for a few years, we're zeroing in on a few countries where we think we can make a big impact and where the burden of NTDs is so high that making an impact in those countries would drive forward progress more broadly. So 2 of those countries are India and Nigeria. And something interesting we're doing in Nigeria is actually working directly with parliamentarians on kind of some peer-to-peer education where we're cultivating champions in parliament so that they can kind of drive forward political progress more broadly. And then, of course, on the more local level, we need to be working really, we see ourselves as kind of breaking down some of the silos between the ministry, you'll have like the Ministry of Eye Health and the Ministry of NTDs. And even though the trachoma and river blindness, obviously there's overlaps there, they're not always talking on a regional, closer to the local level basis, so we try to create those connections. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any information on like evaluation, like going back and seeing like what the adherence is to these regimens? Either these are pills that you take every day? Is that
just once a year?
Oh, just once a year. Okay, never mind. That kind of takes it. The question.
Yeah, it's that simple.
For both treatment and prevention, once a year?
Mm-hmm. In some areas, particularly with the soil transmitted helminths that have very, very high prevalence, you might need to do an MDA twice a year, but typically no more than that.
On average, how long does it take for the worms to get situated within the organs? Is it, I mean, when you're saying like twice a year, is it like 3 to 4 months? Is it 6 months?
That's a very good technical question that I'm not going to try to make up an answer to. I'd be happy to look up an answer and
Can I try answering that briefly? I'm definitely not an expert, but I did attend a class which touched on that. So what these drugs do is like they stop the worms from reproducing, because what they're doing is they're reproducing inside your body, and a lot of times, especially with schistosomiasis, what's happening is the eggs and the larvae, they are the ones which cause the most harm. So that's what these drugs are doing. They're killing them they're stopping them from replication, and they're killing them at the replication cycle. That's something, that's what I remember from one of the class, so I thought that's any help.
Right. I guess I'm wondering like how long that cycle though takes to get into the body. Like, if you're walking around in the dirt, like, with bare feet, like it's not probably the first day that you're getting this, the worms are probably not entering you that very first day, but like what's the time period for the transmission? And then also like, some worms have to live inside you for a while before they can start the replication process. But that's something I can look up too.
No, I'd be happy to send you some more information on that. And again, I know specifically for lymphatic filariasis, for instance, the drugs we currently have don't kill adult worms, they kill just the larva. And because the worms can live for up to 6 years inside of your body, you need to be treating the population annually for at least 6 years in a row. So that every year you're killing off the new ones, and then by year 6, hopefully all of the worms have died off inside. So there's a difference for each one, but these are broad estimates that we have. Thank you.
So you've talked about the connections you have with different governments and government organizations like the United Nations. Do you have any connections with other non-governmental organizations? I'm thinking like Unite for Sight, which focuses a lot on trachoma, and I'm not sure if they focus on river blindness, but it seems kind of up their alley. Do you have any partnerships with organizations like that?
We do. So the Global Network was founded in 2007 as an umbrella organization for a number of NGOs focused on NTDs. And again, this was around the time that the term NTD was actually just starting to come into play. And so these organizations have been working separately on NTDs for many years, and this was a new concept to kind of look at them together. So for instance, the Helen Keller Institute, the Carter Center, I can send you a list of all, I think there were 12 kind of partner organizations, but because we are not, I should make clear, we're not an implementing organization. The programs we fund are always run by partners and by both governmental and non-governmental partners. We are an advocacy and resource mobilization initiative, to use our fancy development words. And we're very intentional about that. We don't want to be an implementing organization because we want these programs to be kind of more sustainable and again, kind of locally run, locally owned.